Lamor Miller Whitehead is a Brooklyn-based pastor who became a prominent and controversial public figure through his ministry, his association with New York political leaders, and his highly publicized lifestyle. He was born in 1978 in Brooklyn, New York. After attending local schools and completing college, he founded Leaders of Tomorrow International Churches, which held services in Brooklyn and later in Paramus, New Jersey. Whitehead cultivated a persona that mixed prosperity preaching with urban celebrity culture. He drove high-end cars, wore luxury designer clothing, and often streamed his sermons live on social media. His congregation was relatively small compared to megachurches, but his media presence drew significant attention. He described himself as an advocate for the community and frequently appeared at press conferences alongside city officials, including the mayor of New York, on issues of policing and violence prevention. By the early 2020s, Whitehead had developed both admirers and critics. Supporters saw him as a man of faith who had risen from difficult circumstances to become a successful leader in his community. Detractors argued that his emphasis on wealth and luxury conflicted with the modesty expected of a pastor. In July 2022, during a Sunday live-stream service, 3 armed men entered the sanctuary and robbed Whitehead and his wife at gunpoint, taking jewelry valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars. The video of the robbery spread widely across the internet, making him an even more polarizing figure. While he told reporters that the robbery was traumatic and symbolized the dangers clergy face, others questioned why he possessed such expensive jewelry in the first place. Several months later, in December 2022, Whitehead was arrested by federal authorities and charged with wire fraud, attempted extortion, and making false statements to the FBI. Prosecutors alleged that he had solicited money from a parishioner under false pretenses, promising to help her purchase a home but instead spending the money on luxury items and personal expenses. They also alleged that he attempted to extort a businessman by claiming he could use his political connections to secure favorable treatment in city projects in exchange for financial payment. Whitehead pleaded not guilty to all charges and publicly claimed that he was being unfairly targeted because of his success and visibility. Throughout the proceedings, he continued to post on social media, declaring his innocence and portraying himself as a man of faith under persecution. His church remained open, though attendance reportedly declined. The federal trial began in early 2024 in the Southern District of New York. During the proceedings, prosecutors presented evidence including text messages, bank records, and witness testimony that supported the charges of fraud and attempted extortion. They argued that Whitehead had manipulated trust within his congregation and community, using his reputation and the image of political access to enrich himself. The defense contended that the deals in question were legitimate business ventures and that there had been no intent to defraud anyone. In March 2024, after deliberation, a jury convicted Whitehead on several counts, including wire fraud and attempted extortion. In June 2024, he was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. The court also ordered him to pay restitution to the victims and forfeit certain assets linked to the criminal conduct. Following sentencing, Whitehead maintained his public stance that the conviction was unjust and announced plans to appeal. His legal team filed notice of appeal, and the case moved into the appellate phase. His church, Leaders of Tomorrow International Ministries, faced serious reputational and operational challenges, with some members leaving and others attempting to keep the ministry active through community work and online services. The case drew extensive media coverage, partly because of Whitehead's flamboyant image and his connections with public figures in New York. Commentators used it to highlight the broader issue of financial transparency within independent ministries and the vulnerability of congregants to exploitation when pastoral and financial authority overlap. Beyond the courtroom outcome, the episode spurred discussion about prosperity theology and the ethics of wealth in religious leadership. Whitehead had consistently preached that material success was evidence of divine favor, a message that resonated with followers seeking empowerment but also attracted criticism from those who saw it as encouraging greed and ostentation. In interviews prior to his conviction, Whitehead often framed his public image as a means to inspire people from disadvantaged backgrounds, arguing that showing success could motivate others to strive for more. However, prosecutors and critics pointed out that his image had also been central to persuading people to trust him financially. As of late 2025, Whitehead remains incarcerated while appealing his conviction. His church continues under interim leadership. The case is frequently cited in discussions of ethics and religious leadership, the influence of social media on modern ministries, and the tension between faith-based authority and financial accountability. In the mid-1970s, a young television preacher from North Carolina began building something that looked at first like a miracle. He and his wife hosted a small Christian talk show that blended faith, variety, entertainment, and testimonials. The format was new, friendly, and distinctly American. The audience loved them. With each episode, donations trickled in, then poured in. The show grew into a network, the network into a ministry, and the ministry into a corporation that owned land, studios, and eventually an enormous Christian resort called Heritage USA. At the height of its success, Heritage USA drew millions of visitors each year. Families came for concerts, themed parks, and religious conferences. The preacher became the face of prosperity within faith, smiling, immaculately dressed, assuring viewers that abundance was proof of divine favor. Supporters bought lifetime partnerships, pledging thousands of dollars in exchange for lodging privileges and a promise that their contributions would expand God's work. The camera captured him beside waterfalls and hotels under construction, proclaiming that faith and generosity would build a paradise for believers. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted to sustain the illusion. Construction costs soared, financial oversight weakened, and the ministry's spending grew more extravagant. Television airtime was expensive, salaries were high, and the resort's income could not match the promises sold on screen. Some accountants warned that selling more lifetime partnerships than the resort could ever honor would invite disaster. But each warning was buried under another broadcast appeal, another segment of music and testimony. Viewers sent more checks. The show stayed on the air. Then in the late 1980s, the facade cracked. Reporters began to question the ministry's finances. Investigators discovered overlapping partnerships that vastly exceeded the resort's capacity, unrecorded transfers of money, and expenses charged to the ministry for personal luxuries. The revelation spread quickly across national television. The image of a holy entrepreneur was replaced by headlines about fraud and misuse of funds. The faithful who had once written checks began writing letters demanding explanations. When federal investigators stepped in, they uncovered a complex web of transactions showing that millions of dollars in donations had been diverted. The charges described a system where faith was packaged as investment, and the audience's devotion was the currency. The indictment listed counts of mail and wire fraud and conspiracy. Court documents detailed how financial records had been manipulated to conceal shortfalls and keep the ministry solvent long enough to maintain its glittering image. The trial drew extraordinary public attention. Supporters filled the benches, clutching Bibles, while critics saw in it the collapse of a televised empire built on unchecked charisma. Former employees testified about creative bookkeeping and relentless fundraising targets. Prosecutors presented spreadsheets and ledgers tracing donation money from the partnership program to private accounts. The defense argued that optimism and poor management, not deliberate deceit, were to blame. But the numbers told a different story. When the verdict arrived, it carried the final punctuation of a decade of excess. The preacher was convicted on dozens of counts. Sentencing day turned into a national broadcast of contrition and disbelief. He was handed a long prison term that symbolized the end of an era in televangelism. The once grand Heritage USA closed its gates, its hotels and theme park falling into disrepair, the sound of hymnals replaced by silence and wind moving through empty buildings. From his cell, the former preacher began to write letters and reflections about faith and failure. Interviews years later revealed a man who claimed to have rediscovered humility through disgrace. He described prison as a refining fire, a place where the persona built for television could no longer survive. After serving several years before parole, he re-entered the world not as a celebrity, but as a man haunted by his own creation. For those who had invested their savings, the aftermath was harder to reconcile. Some never recovered financially. Others said their spiritual lives had been fractured beyond repair. Yet a surprising number still said they forgave him. They spoke of forgiveness as an act of self-preservation, not approval, a way to reclaim their belief from the spectacle that had distorted it. In the decades since, the story of Heritage USA has become part of American religious history, a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition and devotion collide. Scholars cite it as a turning point that reshaped how ministries handle money and transparency. Broadcasters learned that accountability was not a burden but a shield. New regulations and watchdog groups emerged, quietly altering the landscape that once allowed unchecked growth. The preacher eventually returned to broadcasting, humbler but still controversial. To some, his persistence proved the endurance of faith. To others, it showed how easily a fallen figure can step back into the spotlight once the cameras are ready again. Audiences had changed, but curiosity about redemption never faded. The story became not just about one man, but about the culture that built him, watched him rise, and then watched him fall. Today, the ruins of Heritage USA have been repurposed, the land sold and redeveloped, yet pieces of it remain: a crumbling tower, a lake, a chapel. Visitors say the air there feels heavy with memory. It is not haunted in the supernatural sense, but by the echo of promises once broadcast to millions. The dream of a Christian utopia financed through television had ended, leaving behind a reminder of how quickly spiritual passion can turn into enterprise. The preacher's name still provokes debate, fraud to some, flawed visionary to others. What remains indisputable is the magnitude of his influence, both the hope he inspired and the disillusionment he left behind. His story endures because it speaks to something larger than one man. The uneasy bond between faith and money, sincerity and spectacle. When the camera light fades, what is left is the simple question that echoed through every courtroom, newsroom, and living room during his downfall. How do we tell the difference between a messenger and a salesman when both can sound the same? Eddie Lee Long was born on May 12, 1953 in Huntersville, North Carolina. He studied at North Carolina Central University, earning a bachelor's degree in business administration in 1977. After a brief corporate career, he felt a calling to ministry and attended seminary. In 1987, he became the pastor of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, then a modest congregation of around 300 members in Lithonia, Georgia. Over the next 2 decades, Long transformed New Birth into one of the most prominent megachurches in the United States. Membership soared past 25,000, services were broadcast nationally, and the church's campus expanded into a sprawling complex that included a gymnasium, bookstore, and school. Long's sermons combined traditional Baptist preaching with prosperity theology, the idea that faith, positive thinking, and generous giving could lead to material success. His charisma, business acumen, and message of empowerment made him a powerful figure in both religious and political circles. He was invited to the White House during the Clinton administration, spoke at conferences alongside major evangelical leaders, and led outreach programs aimed at young black men. His church became a hub of influence in Atlanta's African-American community, with thousands attending Sunday services and events. By the early 2000s, Eddie Long was widely known as one of the nation's most successful black pastors. His image, tailored suits, confident speech, and luxury cars, symbolized prosperity as divine reward. Supporters viewed him as proof that faith could lift communities out of poverty. But critics argued that the message blurred the line between spiritual fulfillment and material excess. In September 2010, Long's ministry faced its most serious challenge: Four young men, Anthony Flagg, Morris Robinson, Jamal Paris, and Spencer Legrand, filed civil lawsuits accusing him of using his spiritual authority and mentorship to coerce them into sexual relationships while they were teenagers. The plaintiffs alleged that Long had offered them gifts, trips, and financial support while gradually crossing personal boundaries. They claimed he justified the acts as expressions of spiritual intimacy. The lawsuits shocked the congregation and the wider religious community. Long denied all allegations, stating through his lawyers that he was innocent and would vigorously defend himself. In public appearances, he avoided direct comment on the details of the case but told his church, "I'm not a perfect man, but this thing I'm not guilty of." The congregation responded with mixed emotions. Many rallied behind him, while others quietly left. Media outlets across the country covered the case extensively. Commentators debated issues of pastoral power, influence, and vulnerability among young congregants. Supporters said the lawsuits were an attack on a successful black pastor who had built a powerful community institution. Critics argued that the allegations reflected a broader problem of unaccountable authority in large religious organizations. Over several months, both sides prepared for trial while negotiating privately. In May 2011, Long and the plaintiffs reached an out-of-court settlement. The terms were not disclosed and both parties agreed to confidentiality. No criminal charges were filed and the lawsuits were dismissed. Long maintained his innocence throughout. The settlements, however, marked a turning point for New Birth Missionary Baptist Church. Attendance and donations declined sharply, and the ministry's public image suffered. The church faced financial strain as membership fell from tens of thousands to just a few thousand within a few years. Several satellite campuses closed and staff were reduced. Long's personal life also drew renewed scrutiny. Reports surfaced of his expensive lifestyle, including luxury vehicles and a $1 million home. Critics accused him of exploiting prosperity theology for personal gain, while supporters insisted that his success reflected his faith and hard work. He continued to preach but appeared less frequently in public and avoided interviews. Despite the controversies, Long retained a core group of loyal congregants who continued to view him as a spiritual father. They described him as compassionate, disciplined, and unwavering in his mission to help people improve their lives. In sermons after 2011, he spoke more about humility, forgiveness, and perseverance, often referencing the pain of false accusations, without naming his accusers or revisiting the details of the lawsuits. In 2016, Long revealed that he was battling a serious illness, but did not disclose its nature. His sudden weight loss sparked speculation and concern. He told his congregation that God was healing him and asked for continued prayers. On January 15, 2017, Eddie Long passed away at age 63. His death was announced by New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, which cited an aggressive cancer as the cause. Thousands attended his memorial service, including politicians, religious leaders, and longtime church members. After his passing, discussions about his legacy reignited. Supporters emphasized his decades of community work, charity programs, and the spiritual uplift he provided to thousands. They highlighted his contributions to Atlanta's religious and civic life, crediting him with mentoring young ministers and expanding black church leadership in the American South. Critics, meanwhile, pointed to the lawsuits and the damage they caused to victims and the church's reputation. They argued that Long's rise and fall reflected the dangers of celebrity culture in modern ministry, how charisma and unchecked authority can erode accountability. Today, New Birth Missionary Baptist Church continues to operate under new leadership. The congregation remains smaller than during Long's tenure, but it has focused on rebuilding trust and returning to community-centered ministry. The church's leaders have implemented stronger financial oversight and pastoral counseling guidelines, seeking to prevent abuses of power and restore faith among members. Eddie Long's story endures as one of the most consequential in modern American religious history. It illustrates the extraordinary reach of televangelism, the fragility of public trust, and the deep personal costs when faith, influence, and secrecy intertwine. For many, it serves as both an inspiration and a warning, a testament to human ambition and the urgent need for transparency in all institutions built on belief. In the heart of Brooklyn's crowded avenues, a man once stood beneath the stained glass glow of a pulpit that shimmered brighter than the congregation's faith. Cameras loved him. His suits were white, his shoes gold, and every sermon ended with a promise: God doesn't want you poor. The city knew him as the pastor of Gold Street. To his followers, he was proof that faith could buy favor. A man who had escaped the gray edges of poverty to build a church that glittered like a crown. On Sunday mornings, the line for his services wound around the block. Rolls-Royces idled beside city buses. Inside, the air hummed with incense and expectation. People came for salvation, but they stayed for the show. He spoke with a rhythm that felt rehearsed and holy all at once. His words rose and broke like gospel music, the kind that makes a crowd weep before they understand why. When he shouted, "Prosperity is a promise," hands flew up, wallets opened, and belief filled the room like smoke. At first, the city admired him. Reporters called him the miracle in mink. Politicians invited him to ribbon cuttings. Television producers wanted him on air. He never said no. He wore faith like a brand, sleek, unapologetic, monetized. But beneath the stage lights and the filtered Instagram posts, there was another story forming. It began quietly, an elderly woman who'd invested her savings into a church real estate fund that never existed. A young couple who'd been promised a return on a donation if they volunteered enough hours. Small things at first, brushed aside as misunderstandings. He told anyone who asked that God was testing him. Every prophet, he'd say, has haters, and so the congregation defended him. Even as the stories grew stranger, signed checks that disappeared, forged documents, a property deal in another borough that listed his name but not the church's. For a while, it worked. Until one summer morning, the sound of sirens replaced the choir. The arrest shocked everyone. The man they'd seen baptizing children was suddenly in handcuffs, gold cuffs of his own. Cameras flashed again, but this time his smile was gone. Detectives carried boxes of files, hard drives, and ledgers from his office. Each folder told the same story: borrowed money, falsified papers, and a trail of deception dressed in scripture. When prosecutors finally spoke, the words hit harder than any sermon: wire fraud, extortion, false statements. For years, the pastor had been living off promises he never meant to keep. He'd sold faith as a luxury product, convinced investors that heaven had an entry fee. The money had built not only his empire, but also the illusion of blessing. During the trial, the courtroom filled with faces from his old congregation. Some came to support him, others to see justice unfold. The elderly woman who'd lost her savings sat in the second row every day, clutching a worn Bible. When asked why she came, she said, "Because I still believe in forgiveness, but I want to see truth first." Witness after witness spoke. Financial advisors, assistants. One man from the church's board who finally admitted he'd signed papers he didn't understand because he didn't want to question God's anointed. The defense tried to paint him as misunderstood, a victim of ambition. But the evidence was a sermon of its own, clear, rhythmic, undeniable. When the verdict came, it was almost quiet. Guilty on all counts. He spent the last few moments before sentencing staring at the floor. No tears, no outburst, just the faintest whisper that the microphones barely caught. They'll see the truth someday. 9 years. That's what the judge said. The congregation splintered overnight. Some members formed a small prayer circle that still meets in a rented basement. Others renounced religion entirely, saying faith had become a brand they couldn't trust. His church building went up for sale. The gold letters above the doors, "Leaders of Tomorrow," were taken down one by one until nothing was left but the shadow of the words. In the years that followed, people tried to forget. But trust once cracked doesn't mend easily. The city learned to look twice at anyone who preached too loudly about prosperity. For the victims, justice felt both heavy and hollow. The money was gone, the years were gone, and what remained was the ache of betrayal, the kind that turns prayer into silence. Yet, some still lit candles on the church steps every anniversary of his arrest. They said forgiveness was not about absolving the man, but reclaiming their faith from him. What drives someone to turn belief into business? Was it greed, or was it the hunger to be seen as chosen? In a world where a preacher can wear a watch worth more than a follower's home, where the line between faith and performance blurs until it's indistinguishable, maybe the real crime isn't just fraud. Maybe it's how easily people can be convinced that holiness shines brightest when it's reflected in gold. The pastor of Gold Street remains a name spoken carefully in Brooklyn. A warning, a memory. Some say he preaches still, not from a pulpit, but from a narrow room behind steel doors. That his sermons are quieter now, stripped of applause. That he has learned the language of regret. Whether that's true doesn't matter. What matters is what the city learned from him. That trust, once sold, cannot be bought back. That faith should never need proof made of diamonds. And that sometimes, the brightest light in the sanctuary is just the reflection off something counterfeit. They said the shepherd would fall, he thundered one morning, but the Lord lifted me up. To the faithful, he was a prophet. To others, he was a contradiction. A man of God with the heart of a politician and the temper of a soldier. With renewed fame came new ambition. Norris expanded his church's reach through radio broadcasts, revival tours, and printed sermons that circulated across the nation. He spoke against communism, Catholicism, and moral decay, often blending theology with fiery populism. His words resonated with many but alienated others. Critics accused him of using faith as a weapon and influence as currency. Meanwhile, the shadow of the trial never completely lifted. The family of Dexter Chips carried their grief quietly, but their bitterness became a silent fixture in the city's conscience. Chips's widow left Fort Worth, unable to walk past the church that had once condemned her husband in spirit long before the court acquitted his killer. By the 1930s, Norris's empire had grown vast. He founded schools, missions, and a new paper that promoted his brand of conservative Baptist revivalism. He was both admired and feared, the preacher who had killed a man and survived, the pastor whose voice could fill a tent of 10,000, or silence a critic with a single sermon. Yet behind his triumphs lay an unspoken exhaustion. The murder trial had not broken him, but it had hardened him. Friends recalled moments when he seemed haunted, lingering after services, staring at the pulpit as if seeing something no one else could. One assistant pastor once found him alone late at night in the church office, his hands trembling over the same desk where Chips had fallen years before. Norris didn't notice him enter. He was murmuring softly, the same words again and again. I had no choice. In later years, as his influence spread to Detroit and beyond, his confrontational style led to new controversies. Political battles, denominational splits, public feuds. He seemed drawn to conflict, as if it were the only way to reaffirm his sense of divine calling. Yet each fight left another scar on his reputation. He died in 1952 while preaching in Florida, not in disgrace but not in peace either. The papers called him the most controversial preacher of the American pulpit. His funeral drew thousands. Old rivals stayed away, but his followers filled the church, singing hymns of victory and deliverance. They buried him in Fort Worth, beneath a headstone that bore only his name and the words, "He fought the good fight." But what fight had it really been? For decades afterward, theologians, journalists, and historians debated that question. Some said Norris had embodied the contradictions of American religion, moral certainty welded to human pride. Others saw him as a tragic warning that power, once justified as divine, can make a man believe he's untouchable. The office where the shooting happened was eventually remodeled, the bullet holes plastered over, the furniture replaced. Yet older church members whispered that on quiet nights the walls seemed to remember. They said that if you stood there long enough you could almost hear the echo of two men arguing. A flash of anger, the crack of a gun, then silence. It was perhaps fitting that Norris's legacy refused to rest easily. His story lived on in sermons about redemption and in lectures about corruption. Every generation found something new in it: courage or hypocrisy, conviction or delusion. A century later, the case remains one of the strangest intersections of faith and violence in American history. A preacher who carried both a Bible and a gun, a man whose pulpit led not to salvation, but to the courtroom. When you strip away the legend, you're left with a haunting question, one that has no easy answer. Can a man claim to serve God and still draw a gun in his name? It's the kind of question that lingers long after the sermon ends. He called it Grace River Ministries, a name that shimmered with promise. To the people of Meridian Falls, a quiet town just outside Atlanta, Pastor Daniel Mercer was the closest thing to a celebrity they had ever known. His voice filled radios, his smile lit up billboards, and his sermons drew thousands to the converted warehouse that served as both sanctuary and spectacle. They said his words could make a sinner weep and a skeptic believe. He was tall, well-dressed, and always wore a gleaming silver cross that seemed to catch the light just right when he lifted his hands to pray. To his congregation, he wasn't just a preacher. He was proof that faith could look like success. It began small, as most empires do: a rented storefront, 20 folding chairs, and a handful of worshipers who believed in his vision. He preached about redemption, about second chances, about how God didn't just want to save souls, he wanted to bless them. Within a year, the church had grown into hundreds, within 5,000s. By the time Grace River opened its 4,000-seat campus on the outskirts of town, Mercer was already a regional phenomenon. His sermons were broadcast on cable access, then syndicated online. He wrote books, glossy hardcovers with photos of him on the cover, titles like Faith in the Fast Lane and Divine Prosperity. His message was simple: if you gave to God, God would give back. And when people saw how Mercer lived, the custom suits, the mansion on the hill, the sleek black Mercedes, they believed him. After all, wasn't he living proof of divine favor? The donations poured in: tithes, love offerings, special building funds. He told his followers that every dollar was a seed of faith. Plant it in God's soil, he'd say, and watch your blessings multiply. But inside the church's financial office, the soil was rotting. It started with small things: expense reimbursements without receipts, ministry credit cards used for business trips that always seemed to end at luxury resorts. The staff accountant, a quiet woman named Leah, began to notice patterns: large transfers to shell companies, checks written to names that didn't appear on payroll. When she brought it up, Mercer smiled and told her not to worry. God's work doesn't always look tidy on paper, he said. Sometimes you just have to trust the vision. Leah didn't press further. No one did. At Grace River, questioning the pastor was like questioning God himself. Then came the expansion. Mercer announced plans to build a second campus in Nashville, a $12 million project that he promised would bring revival to the nation. He launched the River Rising campaign, urging followers to give sacrificially. Families emptied savings accounts. One elderly widow sold her home and donated the proceeds. Mercer's charisma was relentless. He could make guilt sound like destiny. Behind closed doors, the money flowed not to construction firms, but to offshore accounts. Mercer had found a partner in a smooth-talking financial consultant named Brett Lowell, who specialized in faith-based asset management. Together, they siphoned millions from church accounts into investment fronts, real estate deals, private jets, and foreign accounts masked by scripture-sounding LLCs. For years, it worked. The church grew louder, richer, flashier. Mercer began traveling with a personal security team. He told his flock it was necessary because of threats, though none were ever reported. He called himself a shepherd under siege. But greed doesn't age well. In late 2018, a young journalist from a local paper started asking questions. Her name was Emily Carter, a religion correspondent barely out of college. She'd attended one of Mercer's services while covering a feature on megachurch growth. What caught her eye wasn't the message, it was the money. Ushers passed buckets 3 times in 1 hour, and the donation screens kept looping a graphic that read, "Text to bless, every dollar is a miracle." When she asked for financial transparency, her requests were ignored. So she dug deeper: tax records, property filings, nonprofit disclosures. What she found didn't add up. Mercer's personal real estate holdings had quadrupled in 4 years, yet Grace River's charitable expenditures had dropped by nearly half. Her article hit like a thunderclap. Grace or greed? Questions surround Pastor Mercer's empire. The story went viral overnight. Mercer called it a spiritual attack, denouncing the journalist from his pulpit as a tool of darkness. The congregation erupted in applause, but beneath the cheers, something in the air had shifted. Doubt, quiet, dangerous, and contagious, had entered the sanctuary. Then, 1 month later, the FBI arrived. The raid took place on a Sunday morning, just as Mercer was beginning his sermon. Agents in plain clothes moved through the crowd quietly, serving warrants, seizing financial records, escorting the pastor out a side door. The congregation sat in stunned silence. For a moment they thought it was part of the message, until they saw the handcuffs. The charges: wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement exceeding $8, $3 million. As the details emerged, the illusion shattered. The lavish cars and private jet were purchased with donation funds. The Nashville campus didn't exist. The land Mercer had claimed to buy was a vacant lot owned by one of his shell companies. Even the church's humanitarian outreach photos had been staged with hired actors. When the trial began, Mercer pleaded not guilty. His defense team argued that he'd simply mismanaged funds, that he'd been overzealous in ministry, not criminal in intent. But prosecutors painted a far darker picture, a man who built a kingdom of faith only to plunder it from within. Witnesses described meetings where Mercer boasted of being too anointed to fail. Others recounted being pressured to donate under spiritual threat, told that withholding their tithe was robbing God. The widow who'd sold her home testified through tears. She said Mercer had promised her a divine return, that her sacrifice would build God's house. "I just didn't know," she said, "that I was buying his." The verdict came after 3 weeks of testimony, guilty on all counts. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Mercer looked up, calm, polished, still wearing his silver cross. "I may have fallen short of men's laws," he said, "but I've never fallen short of God's grace." He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Grace River closed within months. The Grand Sanctuary was sold to a logistics company. The neon sign that once read, "Believe Big," was taken down and left to rust in a storage yard. From his prison cell, Mercer continued to write newsletters, devotionals, even a book titled Faith Behind Bars. He signed each letter with the same phrase he'd once used in his sermons: "The vision lives on." But the people of Meridian Falls moved on without him. Some joined smaller churches. Others abandoned religion altogether. The widow who'd lost her home now lived with her daughter in another town. She kept one of Mercer's old books on a shelf, not as a reminder of faith, but as a warning. Years later, when Emily Carter was interviewed about the story that started it all, she said something that stayed with viewers. Pastor Mercer's greatest sermon wasn't the one he preached from the pulpit. It was the one his life became, about how power, when sanctified by belief, can justify anything. Mercer will be eligible for parole in 2034. His supporters still send him letters, convinced of his innocence. His detractors call him a symbol of corruption. But the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, in that murky place where faith and ambition blur, and the man who once promised blessings ends up praying for forgiveness behind locked doors. Because in the end, the story of Daniel Mercer isn't about money or miracles. It's about the moment when a man stops listening to God and starts believing he is him. And when that happens, there's only one place left to go, from pulpit to prison. They called him Pastor Jonah. though his full name was Jonah Whitmore, and for most of his life, he believed God had chosen him to save people. For years in the small Kentucky town of Haven Ridge, he did exactly that, or so it seemed. The church he founded, Redeemer's Light Tabernacle, started in an abandoned barn with 20 members and a dream. Whitmore was young, handsome, magnetic. He had a voice that could shake a room and a way of speaking that made ordinary people feel extraordinary. To the weary, he promised healing. To the poor, he promised hope. To everyone, he promised truth, but it was his truth, not God's. He preached about spiritual warfare, about a world corrupted by demons and faithless men. His sermons grew darker with time, his tone more urgent. "Evil walks among us," he'd say, pacing the stage. And sometimes the devil doesn't wear horns. He wears a smile. People loved him for it. Fear, after all, is a kind of faith. By 2011, Redeemer's Light had over 1,000 members. The church compound sprawled across 10 acres, a chapel, dormitories, and a gated perimeter. Whitmore said it was to keep temptation out, but in truth it kept everyone else away. He controlled everything: what people wore, what music they listened to, who they married, even what they ate. He said the world outside was poisoned by sin, that only those who lived within the walls were truly chosen. He called his followers the flock. They gave him everything: money, labor, loyalty. Women were told it was their duty to serve the pastor as a vessel of God's anointing. Men were taught to obey him without question. He convinced them that questioning him was the same as questioning the Almighty. And for years no one did. Then came Sarah Lowe. She joined the church in 2013, a single mother of 2 looking for stability. Whitmore took her under his wing. He told her she was special, that he saw a light in her that others couldn't. Soon he made her his assistant, then his spiritual confidant. Rumors spread. Whispered doubts about the time she spent alone in his office, the locked doors, the nights she didn't return home. One evening, during a midweek prayer meeting, Sarah stood up in front of the congregation and began to speak. Her hands shook. Her voice trembled. "Pastor Jonah isn't who you think he is," she said. The room froze. She said he had lied, that he had used his position to manipulate and harm. The gasps turned to murmurs. Whitmore stood motionless at first, then walked slowly toward her. "You're not yourself, Sarah," he said, voice calm. "The enemy's got hold of your heart." She shook her head. "No," she said. "You're the enemy." He smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and told 2 of his deacons to escort her out. That night Sarah and her children disappeared. Whitmore told the congregation she'd gone back to her old life of sin, that the devil had reclaimed her. He asked the church to pray for her soul. They did. But 3 months later, her car was found submerged in a creek 6 miles from the compound. The driver's door was open. Inside were a child's shoe, a Bible, and a blood-stained scarf. Sarah's body was never found. For the first time, cracks appeared in the church's armor. Members began whispering, questioning. Whitmore countered every doubt with fire. His sermons became more apocalyptic, his rhetoric more violent. "God is testing us," he told them. "The world is trying to destroy his chosen. We cannot falter." But the outside world was closing in. Detective Eli Sanders of the Kentucky State Police had been following the church for months, ever since reports of missing persons and financial irregularities started to overlap. When Sarah's car was pulled from the water, he began connecting dots: bank withdrawals, witness statements, property deeds in Whitmore's name. A warrant was issued to search the compound. On the morning of October 18, 2014, police vehicles rolled up to Redeemer's Light. Members stood at the gates praying and chanting. Whitmore emerged in a white robe, Bible in hand. He shouted that they had no authority there. Officers entered anyway. Inside the main office, they found firearms, stacks of cash, and sealed envelopes labeled Emergency Exodus Fund. In a locked storage room beneath the sanctuary, they discovered something else: a burial pit freshly filled. The forensics team unearthed remains later confirmed to belong to Sarah Lowe and one of her children. The news broke like wildfire. The same man who had baptized half the county was now accused of murder. Whitmore was arrested that afternoon. As officers led him away, his congregation cried and screamed, some collapsing to their knees. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "They'll crucify me like they did him." At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. DNA linked him to the scene. Financial records revealed massive fraud. Witnesses, former members, testified to years of control, psychological abuse, and threats of divine punishment. One man recounted being told that disobedience would make his soul rot before his body did. Whitmore's defense claimed the deaths were accidental, that Sarah had taken her own life and her child's in despair. But the prosecution had a different story. A man whose ego had metastasized into delusion, who believed that killing a doubter was purifying the flock. He was convicted of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Even after sentencing, he refused to admit guilt. In his final sermon before incarceration, recorded secretly by a visitor, he said, "The world may lock my body away, but my spirit is untouchable." You can't imprison God's chosen. His followers fractured. Some left and rebuilt their lives. Others continued to write him letters, sending money to a prison ministry fund. They said they still felt his presence when they prayed. Years later, Detective Sanders was asked what he remembered most about the case. He didn't mention the evidence or the trial. Only the first time he looked Whitmore in the eyes. "I've seen killers before," he said. "But this one truly believed God would forgive him because he never thought he was wrong." Today, the land where Redeemer's light once stood is overgrown. The chapel is gone, demolished after the conviction. Locals say no one wants to build there, that the ground feels heavy. At night, if you drive past, you can still see the old signpost, the words barely visible beneath rust and rain. The light still shines. But it doesn't, not anymore. Because in the story of Jonah Whitmore, the light became something else, obsession masquerading as faith, violence disguised as righteousness. And in the end, that's what sent him from pulpit to prison. They called themselves the Ash Grove Communion, a quiet congregation tucked into the damp pines of northern Arkansas, miles from the nearest town. To the handful of families who moved there in the mid-1980s, it was supposed to be a sanctuary from a world they believed had lost its soul. The man who convinced them of that was Pastor Caleb Rourke, a preacher with a smile so calm it made you forget to breathe. Rourke had once been a traveling revivalist. He preached in tents behind supermarkets, promising healing, forgiveness, and a second Eden for those who truly believed. By 1983, he said the Lord had given him a new command, to build the garden again. The land he purchased had once been a lumber camp. He renamed it Ash Grove, after the trees that had burned there in a forest fire years before. He told his followers that from ash came purity. In the beginning, nothing seemed dangerous. Families built cabins, planted vegetables, and gathered in a rough wooden chapel Rourke called the Hall of the Covenant. Children were taught scripture by lantern light. Adults worked the fields and turned their paychecks over to the church. Money corrupts, Rourke said, so let the church handle it. It was small sacrifices at first, selling cars, giving up television, mailing letters only through the commune office. Rourke's sermons grew longer, quieter, stranger. He spoke of purification by flame, of the world's end, of a day when the faithful would be lifted through fire into light. When one family tried to leave, he warned the others that doubt was the first spark of damnation. Within a month, no one mentioned the family's name again. By 1986, the commune had nearly 80 members. Outsiders called it a cult, but the sheriff's office found no crimes, just people who didn't want to talk. Rourke registered the church as a nonprofit, filed every tax form correctly, and appeared polite whenever officials visited. He always offered pie and prayer. Behind closed doors, however, discipline had become ritual. Members were made to stand for hours in front of the chapel's iron stove, confessing sins until Rourke believed they had been cleansed by heat. He called it the Trial of Ash. The first real sign that something had gone terribly wrong came in February 1987, when a young woman named Lydia Marin was taken to the county hospital with burns on her arms and back. She told doctors she'd fallen asleep near the stove. When police asked to speak with her again, she'd disappeared, signed out against medical advice, the nurse said, escorted by two men in plain suits who claimed to be her cousins. Her car was later found abandoned on a gravel road leading back to Ash Grove. Inside the commune, Rourke began teaching that the world had ended spiritually, and only those who walked through flame could live again. He drew diagrams on chalkboards, circles within circles, numbers that matched passages in Revelation. He rationed food, insisting fasting purified the soul. Those who questioned him were sent to prayer, locked for days in a dark storage shed with only water and scripture. By autumn, a few members managed to flee. They told deputies about strange midnight gatherings where Rourke made them burn their old belongings, clothes, photos, even marriage licenses, claiming earthly attachments trapped the soul. Their accounts sounded delusional, conflicting, impossible to prove. No warrants were issued. In rural Arkansas, a man could run his church however he pleased. Everything changed on March 12, 1988. A fire tore through the Ash Grove compound before dawn. It burned fast, feeding on dry timber and kerosene stored for lamps. When firefighters arrived, the chapel was a wall of flame. 23 people were found dead inside, many in a circle around the pulpit. Among them was Caleb Rourke, seated upright in a chair, Bible open on his lap. His fingerprints were on a 5-gallon fuel can. The county coroner ruled it a murder-suicide, but not everybody matched the membership list. 3 children the survivors swore had been there were never found. Some said Rourke had sent them away before the fire to spread the word. Others believed they perished unseen, consumed completely by the blaze. The truth vanished with the smoke. In the months that followed, investigators pieced together bank records, letters, and tape recordings Rourke had made for his inner circle. He spoke calmly about releasing souls through the flame, a perverse reinterpretation of baptism. The district attorney called it mass homicide wrapped in theology. Survivors called it deliverance gone mad. Reporters flooded the area. Documentaries followed. The Ash Grove Communion joined the long American list of rural utopias turned infernos. And yet, for those who had lived there, the most haunting question wasn't why Rourke did it, but why they believed he could save them at all. Years later, the site remains fenced off, overgrown with vines and charred beams. Every November, someone leaves a single Bible on the stone steps of the chapel ruins. Its pages are always turned to Isaiah 61:3. To give unto them beauty for ashes. When dawn broke over what had been Ash Grove, the smell of burning pine still hung thick in the valley. Sheriff's deputies set up tape around the perimeter, their boots sinking into the soft, blackened earth. It was quiet except for the hiss of water soaking embers and the static of radio chatter. Every officer who walked through the remains of the chapel said the same thing later. It didn't look like chaos. It looked arranged. The bodies weren't scattered. They sat upright, many holding hands, faces turned toward the pulpit where Rourke's chair still stood. The sheriff found a small cassette recorder near his feet. When played, it contained only one thing, Rourke's voice reading the book of Malachi, slow and even, until midway through chapter 4. The tape melted into silence right before the line, "For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven." At first, authorities assumed mass suicide. But within a week, the state fire marshal's report shifted the tone. There were traces of accelerant poured in deliberate trails from the pulpit outward. Many of the victims had inhaled smoke. They were alive when the fire began. The conclusion was horrifyingly simple. Someone started the fire while the congregation was still inside. 3 survivors were found wandering the woods nearby. Ellen Shaw, David Lorne, and a teenage boy named Micah Harper. All bore burns, dehydration, and signs of prolonged confinement. Ellen was the first to speak. She told investigators that the fire wasn't spontaneous. It was commanded. He said it was time to enter the fire, she whispered. He said the Lord would walk among the flames and find only the pure. Her voice trembled as she described the final sermon. Rourke had stood in the chapel holding a steel bucket of ash. He marked each forehead with it, murmuring a prayer she could barely hear. Then he ordered the doors barred from the inside. He said, "We've been waiting for the trumpet too long. It's time we blow it ourselves." Ellen and David managed to pry open a side window when the flames reached the rafters. They dragged Micah through the gap and ran barefoot into the woods. Behind them, she said, the fire sounded like thunder. They weren't screaming, she recalled. They were singing. The investigation uncovered years of meticulous planning. Rourke had emptied church accounts weeks earlier, converting money to gold coins buried in mason jars on the property. He'd ordered bulk shipments of lamp oil and kerosene labeled as donations for winter heat. His journals revealed a fixation with cleansing rituals, a belief that humanity had already died spiritually, and that only through literal fire could the soul become light. It was methodical, theological madness. Forensic teams found small bones near the edge of the property, animals, possibly dogs. But among them was a fragment that didn't match. The medical examiner believed it belonged to a child under 10. That single discovery reclassified the case from mass suicide to mass murder. The missing children from the membership list were presumed dead. In nearby towns, the story took over every newspaper. "Preacher of fire," one headline called him. Locals came forward with their own memories of Rourke. A man who'd once preached at revivals, polite and magnetic, who could make scripture sound like poetry. No one could explain how that same man had come to orchestrate one of the most chilling communal deaths in state history. Months turned into years. Survivors tried to rebuild their lives, but the world outside didn't make sense to them anymore. Ellen moved to Missouri and later wrote a memoir called Through the Flame, trying to make peace with what she'd endured. David never spoke publicly again. As for Micah, he vanished from records altogether. Some said he changed his name. Others claimed he returned to the site every year on the fire's anniversary. In 1993, a film crew revisited Ash Grove for a documentary. They found the chapel's foundation overgrown, its stones covered in moss. But inside the rubble, they discovered something strange, the charred remains of another recorder. When restored, it played a man's voice whispering faintly over the hiss of static. "If the world will not burn for him, then we will." Experts later confirmed it was Rourke's. The audio ended with a child's voice asking, "When do we wake up?" No one ever determined exactly when Rourke lost the line between faith and delusion. Psychologists who studied the tapes said his writings showed patterns of messianic narcissism, the belief that one's suffering redeems others. But for those who lost family in that fire, explanations meant nothing. Their loved ones weren't symbols or data points. They were people who just wanted to believe in something bigger than themselves. The county eventually bulldozed the ruins, yet every autumn, locals swear they see faint lights moving through the trees at night, pale flickers like candles, drifting near the spot where the chapel once stood. No one goes close. The land is still marked as private property, though no owner has claimed it in decades. In the end, the Ash Grove Communion became one more name in a grim American litany, a reminder that devotion, when twisted by the wrong hands, can turn holy fire into hellfire. And for every investigator who stood among those ashes, one question lingered, impossible to shake. If faith can lead the lost into the light, who leads the faithful when the light itself goes dark? From greed to faith gone wrong, these stories reveal how power can twist even the most sacred vows. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and stay with us as we uncover more chilling tales of preachers who cross the line from the pulpit to prison.